Welcome to You're Making It Worse. I'm Elliot Glazer.
I'm Brent Sullivan.
And I'm H. Alan Scott.
We're here. We're queer.
Meh. Textual healing.
So Dan Savage, the only man who talks about sexuality more than Elliot Wexler Glazer.
Well, he's a sex therapist.
Well, he's a sex therapist, and you, quite frankly, are unhinged, if we're being honest with our listeners. A theme that I haven't mentioned recently, but that doesn't change the fundamentals that Elliot remains as sexually unhinged as he ever has. Before he records our podcast, he runs through the bushes outside of his home to see if there's any gentlemen in hiding.
Like Cisco.
Any gentlemen in hiding to see if he could have a rendezvous in the moments before we
All
get
right,
on.
let's go.
That said, so Dan Savage has coined a new term that's gaining traction online on sites like Zimbio, GeoCities, and AOL. And what is
so funny? Zimbio. What a good reference.
okay?
Brent just wants to go on. He's
Yeah,
so
I mean,
annoyed right
I
now.
But
didn't
you wrote the
anticipate
joke.
Annoyed.
I did.
It's
No, I'm
so
happy.
funny.
I just didn't anticipate that getting such a response.
Zimbio.
Zimbio. So the term is polyamory, and it's a portmanteau of tolerate and polyamory, and it refers to a relationship dynamic in which one or both partners puts up with or tolerates the other's outside sexual or romantic contact. Unlike polyamory and other forms of consensual non-monogamy, it's not something that the couple has explicitly discussed and agreed to. So an example that I read was basically the Clintons. Bill Clinton kind of, putzed around, I guess, and yeah, right. And Hillary just is kind of like, rolls her eyes or whatever.
Yeah.
So this is the quote that Savage used on his podcast to describe this new status. Quote, "It's someone willing to turn a blind eye to a lap dance or a brief affair after years of marriage. They're able to focus on all the ways their spouse demonstrates their commitment and shows their love. And all of those other ways compensate or make the cheating that might have happened tolerable. These people aren't fools or dupes. They're not to be pitied. They know what they got. They know what they signed up for long ago and made peace with what they got. They're willing to put up with it, a certain amount of it, reconciled to it, willing to tolerate. They are, in a word, polyamorous." This is not to be confused. I'm rolling my eyes now. Not to be confused with DADT, which is another form of polyamory called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, in which both partners don't speak of their trysts. And then there's PUD, polyamory under duress, which is when one partner voices their desire to be polyamorous and the other partner goes along with it to preserve the relationship, albeit begrudgingly.
I wonder where all this. What's it called? Ethical non-monogamy.
Ethically non-monogamous. Yeah.
I wonder if there's big
you
differences
that
in that.
Now.
Yeah, I wonder if that's different. Oh yeah, ENM. It's relationship or structure where partners explicitly consent to romantic, intimate, or sexual relationships with multiple people. So I guess that's different because this polyamory is tolerating without necessarily acknowledging it.
Yeah.
I'm so bored with all of this. I am so over. I mean, this is part of this is like what I hate about being queer is that we can't be different enough. So we have to. Now, because crazies out there will want to think, oh, well, then they want to go in a gender direction and be like, that's right, everyone wants to be a different gender. No,
marry dogs next.
That's not what I'm talking about. That is not what I'm talking about. Yes, if a person says they are the gender they are, you believe them, you respect them, you use their pronouns. That is how we work. That said, when it gets into the relationships and like the what we want to describe as the relationships we have, threesomes, polyamory, all these different things, I'm just so like, it doesn't matter. Please just exist as the human being you present to me that you want me to respect and love and appreciate. And then just do the things you want to do with your partners respectfully. And you don't fuck people over and be a dick about it. That's literally all That's all I care about. I'm done with all the definitions. They're so exhausting to me.
I mean, to be honest, polyamory and PUD are so similar. There's so little daylight that I'm just at that point. You're like, good God, who?
To say
and
you're
like,
in a TUD relationship?
Who goes to a party and they're like, oh, I'm polyamorous under duress. It's like, who says that? Like,
Yeah.
and if you, I don't know, I feel like if you have the wherewithal and the time on your hands to research PUD and use it eloquently in context, then just leave your partner. Then how about
it just
that?
feels it feels like something. It feels like definitions written by someone who is out of work and is really needing a creative writing assignment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Dan
It just
Savage
feels.
is a sex therapist. He's beloved.
Dan
And so-
Savage is also a piece of shit, and let me tell you why. Because I do think this. Dan Savage, to me, I mean, I don't mind Dan Savage. He's not a piece of shit, but I do think that he is overrated in terms of why he is the one. It's sort of like, you know, back in the day when there was one queer writer, David Sedaris, and everyone was like, "Did you read Me Talk Pretty one day?" And it was like, did you not know that there are other queer books out there by queer writers that existed that were funny? No, there are.
Who's funny
David
though?
He is funny. He's great. And I love that book. But what I'm saying is that, like, what we like to do because of lack of options, we're like, this is the person.
Yes.
This is the
Yes.
person who knows the thing about that one thing that we care that they know about. And for Dan, it's always been sex stuff. And yes, he's a sex therapist, but it's also just like, he's like the only one defining all of this. And I'm just like, get some other voice. Please take a week off and have a woman host your goddamn show or something so we can have a different perspective or something. I don't know.
I'm sure there's plenty of female hosted sex
not at the
sex
level
shows.
of Dan Savage, and
Well,
that's my point.
That ain't
my
his
point.
fault. That ain't my fault.
That's not his fault, but that is our fault because we only turn to him. We only give him the views. We don't give that other person the views. We don't seek out that other voice.
Sure.
And
You're
that
saying
is the problem.
The greater whole, it is the greater whole's fault.
Yeah.
So
The greater hole's fart, indeed.
False. So that said, I actually remember I listened to Dan Savage. I go through cycles with him. I haven't listened to him in like fucking 8 years, but I do remember a conversation. One of the most memorable calls he got was someone called in and they said that their father had cheated on their mom, and it was like, I think the mom found out the father had cheated at one point in their 40-year relationship, and they said the mom wanted to leave, and they were so upset, and his response was essentially like, why would you have, if you've had by all other accounts, you've had 40 successful, loving, committed years together. Why would you, leave and throw it away just because someone had a moment of weakness? And certainly, I don't know if he stressed this. Certainly, I respect there's a power dynamic there, and which can be very difficult, for women and all these things. But I certainly get the argument that he's making, which is like, if 99.5% of the time you guys make it work, and there have been some mistakes over the years, I don't know if you should end a relationship based off of that.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I feel like it's largely what this polyamory is, which is like turning a blind eye. But yeah,
I get that, but it's also sad in that I remember when I was converting to Judaism and I had to take, classes, and in those classes, they're usually comprised of couples who are, someone who's marrying a Jew and they are converting to Judaism. That's usually what it is. But outside of that, there are people like me, just me. And then there are women, often senior citizens, who are widows who were in marriages their entire lives, married to a man that forced them to be Episcopalian, basically, but they always felt like they were Jewish, and they were forced into this dynamic. And sure, they probably had a wonderful marriage and had wonderful kids and had a wonderful life, but the fact that they had to wait for that person to die in order to be the spiritual person, or even just the person that they wanted to be. You also see that with, queer women, with queer men. You see it in lots of different cases. But the fact that you have to wait that long, tolerate that kind of life for that long, just for this person to die to then find who you are, that's fucking bullshit to me. And that's where it's like we should have, and that's why I'm like, other people should be arguing, other shows should be having conversations. Women should be as famous as Dan Savage to have the conversations around maybe communicating those needs early on. How do we address that toxic masculinity down so that other people and other voices can have a say in the relationship? Shit like that. And you don't hear that talked about a lot.
Yeah. You keep bringing up these female sex columnists and therapists. I'm like, why aren't you listening to them, Alan?
Well, I am. You can talk to. I mean, you can talk about relationships and individuality and personalities with Roxane Gay. You can talk. I mean, there are people out there who are, yes, they're very famous, but I'm talking about we as a queer people only go to the one source that we all know is the popular source, and that bothers me because it's often a white man.
Yeah,
and that I think is a bad perspective to only have.
Sure. Now, what do you think, Elliot?
I just think, I don't know, I've said this before, it just sounds like polyamory or PUD or any of you. They just all sound exhausting, and I feel like if you are open and communicative with your partner about what you need and want, I don't think you really need a definition as much as you just need to have that language, that shared language with your partner that will hopefully keep things, simpatico.
It's also funny, and this is, I think, probably a stereotype, but whenever I envision one-sided, polyamorous relationships, which is one partner doesn't really want it, but the other one does, I always picture straight couples.
So do I.
And I'm sure there's plenty of instances, certainly, of gay couples that are in situations like this too, where one person is gung ho. I mean, here's something that I've found to be perhaps maybe the most challenging of all of the power dynamics when it comes to opening up a relationship is what happens when one person inevitably is more popular or desired than the other. And to me, like that, I mean, certainly just coming from my own unique perspective, I'm a very jealous person, and but for me, that's sort of like a nightmare scenario. And I see it on Grindr a lot. You see these like couple profiles, and you'll have two pictures, and you're like, well, one is wildly more attractive than the other, and I have no doubt that there are people that people will message these profiles saying, "Can I have guy behind door number 1 instead of not door number 2?" And what that does to a relationship. I mean, I just think my belief is you have to be very, very secure in your relationship
to
for
be
that
able
not
to
to
say,
be problematic.
Yeah, that sounds horrible. God.
Yeah, it sounds
sounds
complicated.
horrible
It sounds
to
too
me.
complicated when it's like, can we just go to have a nice dinner?
Yeah, I know. And
we
then
have to talk
have
about
a
all
four-way
these
cuddle
things.
afterwards. We'll have a four-way cuddle.
Yeah, watch a Sarah Paulson movie.
Yeah. Elliot, have you ever had a four-way cuddle with anyone?
No.
No. You ever had a three-way cuddle with anyone?
No.
No.
Have you?
No. I'm not wildly sexual.
Wildly
Not even joking.
Oh my God, we have a returning guest this week. It's rare for us to have
Very rare.
guests on more than once, which is wild because we've been doing this for so long. But we're so glad to welcome Ramin Setoodah. Hello, Ramin.
Hey, Ramin.
Hey guys, I'm so excited to be back with you. I remember the first interview we did was for my first book about The View, and it was in LA in person. So it's a little different.
Yeah,
a little different. And I'm guessing Elliot and Alan talked to you about The View for 4 hours that we ultimately edited down to 25 minutes? But
it was long. It was like volumes of podcasts that we could have done.
We are obsessed with The View.
Rosie has said, like, I that was the biggest mistake of my career.
Wait,
Whoa.
Doing the book or the
Like,
review?
yeah,
What does
doing
that
the
feel
interview
like?
with me, but
I don't know
she
if you
said
heard
that.
that.
I think
Sorry, I
the first,
didn't
did
mean
she
to
say it again and again? Maybe she did say it again and again on Howard Stern. But that can't. She was in Exit to Eden. That can't be the worst mistake of her career.
Yes, that part.
Very
And you
fair.
can't find.
Very
I've been
fair.
trying to find Exit to Eden somewhere. Like it's not. You can't get it digitally. Anything. I'm dying to get it. I need to own it.
This is a tangent, but Brent will honestly want to hear this just for material. But when I was a kid, I was like very scared of a lot of things, including sex. And I saw Exit to Eden, and there was a scene where I think a woman sits on somebody's back, like nude, and I was like, no. And I think I don't know if it was Rosie, but I was like, skin to skin. I was so freaked out.
It wasn't Rosie. It wasn't Rosie.
We on this podcast certainly love the irony that Elliot as a child was afraid of sex, and now it is his other language, quite frankly.
That is not
very sexual,
true.
Very sexual.
Yeah.
Back to Ramin. Back to Ramin.
Yeah. So Ramin is back.
Exit to Eden. That should just be the whole show today.
Well, Ramin, so much has changed. I think because when you were last here, I don't think you were editor-in-chief of Variety yet. Were you?
No, not at the time.
No, so much has changed for you. You have, of course, the book, your book on The View, Ladies Who Punch: The Explosive Inside Story of The View, became a New York Times bestseller. You became editor-in-chief of Variety, and now you are out with a new book called Apprentice in Wonderland: How Donald Trump and Mark Burnett Took America Through the Looking Glass. So congratulations, first off, on all your crazy success over the years. It's been, it's been amazing.
Thank you very, very much. And this book, I'm very excited to talk to you guys about the book, because I think a lot of people, when they hear about Donald Trump, they obviously don't, there's so much saturation about him, and everyone feels like, he's on the news all the time. He's on social media all the time. What else is there to say? But I really did approach this book like I approached my first book, where I wanted to go in and tell the definitive story of what it was like and how reality TV created Donald Trump and made him and propelled him to the White House. And so I announced that I was working on this book. And when I announced my View book, it took me forever to get Barbara Walters. It was so hard. I wrote her letters. I, waited. I was very patient. I announced this book, and Donald Trump's office reached out to me and said he would be happy to talk to me. And we had 6 interviews over 2.5 years. And it was so much easier to get time with Donald Trump than it was to get time with Barbara Walters. But
which should tell you something.
I really tried to get inside Donald Trump's head, for better or for worse, and explain who he is and how he views fame and how he really truly is still living in a world where he's a reality star.
Well, and that's something I want to ask you about. So, you're right. The Donald Trump saturates media completely. I mean, and also he's good for business, for media in a lot of ways too. His stories get lots of clicks. And there is an argument to be made that we don't need more about Donald Trump. We don't need to know more about Donald Trump. But what I find so great about your book, and I'm like 3/4 of the way through, because you sent it to me this like last week or a few days ago, and it's so good. But what I love about your book is that you're learning an aspect of how this man sort of became the person he became in the White House, and how we as a public who consumed what he was giving us helped him get to that place. And we're kind of, in a weird way, culpable in a lot of ways too. And so I wanted to know why you wanted to do this book, why you wanted to put something out there about Donald Trump, and how fucked up, was it crazy to spend 6 hours with Donald Trump? Because I think that's more than most people want to spend with Donald Trump, even people he pays to have fun with.
Yeah, people he pays to have fun with. That's a euphemism. Yes. It is crazy being in the same room with him, but it also is, and maybe I'm going to get some flack for this, but it's entertaining being around him, because it's like he says one thing and then another. He has takes on everything. He is someone who really consumes pop culture and is interested in pop culture. He asked me things like, how are Nielsen ratings calculated? Are there meters?
He doesn't even know. He's always talking about ratings. He doesn't even know how they're calculated.
One of my favorite stories, and it hasn't gotten that much pickup, but one of my favorite stories was when he talked about how, for him, loyalty is when he TiVos. He called it TiVo, and then I asked him if he had DVR. He wasn't sure if it was TiVo or DVR, but he TiVos Fox News because Hannity is nice to him. He tries to TiVo Hannity so that Hannity gets a Nielsen bump, but then he wasn't sure whether or not that would actually help him. But he loves TiVoing people who are loyal to him to help them with Nielsen ratings. That's his definition.
It's shockingly stupid, though. Yeah,
shockingly.
But it gives you insight into how he views the world. It's all about ratings, fame, popularity,
and loyalty.
And if you look at Donald Trump through the paradigm of reality TV, I really think it gives you focus in terms of who he is. Right? We're all very confused. Why is he talking about Silence of the Lambs? Why is he talking about sharks? What is he saying? What's going on?
Toilets, washing machines.
It makes no sense until you think about it. As it's like when Paris Hilton went to Walmart and asked, "Do they sell walls here?" because she knew that would be funny on The Simple Life.
Ramin,
is doing a performance.
I love you, Ramin.
He's doing something that's he's just trying to get people engaged and interested, and there are a lot of low information voters that only see the shark stuff and think, okay, well, I'm going to vote for him because he seems kind of funny.
Do you? I have trouble believing that, that nonsense. He's babbling about nonsense to the point where in those clips the audience behind him looks perplexed, either tuned out or perplexed. I can't imagine that's he doesn't. He seems so reckless and and scattered that it doesn't. I can't imagine that is pointedly strategic when he just seems like he's got like mashed potatoes for brains? Do you really think it's like strategic? He's doing it on purpose?
I don't know if I would call it strategic, but I think it's a performance, because when he was with me, it wasn't like he was going off on windmills and sharks. He was, I think he's in an audience. It's kind of like when you're performing for a large crowd and you want to make them laugh, and he gets a high off of that. And I think so much of his life was spent on reality TV where he could say whatever he wanted, and then editors would come in and make sense of it. And so I do think he has all this positive reinforcement to be as over the top and ridiculous as possible, and people like that, and it led to ratings. And he would sit in the boardroom with Kenya Moore and Vivica A. Fox and try to figure out who tweeted what from whose phone while Geraldo was sitting there looking horrified. And that translated to success. The next day, Access Hollywood, Entertainment Tonight, The Today Show, they were covering him. They were wanting him on. They wanted his family on. He created really his entire family through The Apprentice. Ivanka being a judge on the show, Don Jr. being a judge on the show, sitting with their father, allowing them to have their own businesses as a result of the show. And in the beginning of the book, Trump and I do talk about the Kardashians. And I think that is a good parallel, because Donald Trump used reality TV in a similar way than the Kardashians did, in that he really created a business branding, made everyone in America know about his family, sold clothes out of The Apprentice, his own suit line at Macy's. It really was a huge phenomenon. And I think when you try to look at Donald Trump through that lens, things really shift. And I think he's easier to understand.
Well, and also, I mean, I think what you said earlier about him being entertaining and, people finding that troubling, I think, and I've been saying that for years, that I think that's at the core of Donald Trump's appeal, is that, and I mean, like, even if I take politics aside, he is a fun thing to watch. He is an entertaining, how he speaks. He is a showman in a lot of ways, and he has that ability. It's sort of like, I don't want to compare him to Reagan, but it is kind of like the Reagan quality.
I was actually going to ask you that. Yeah, I was going to ask if you guys think there's a similarity there.
I think Reagan had more going on upstairs, but I do think that, like, there is that quality of sort of, he knows how to put on a show, even though it's a crazy talking about sharks all over the place show. He knows how to put on a show so that you leave the conversation at least feeling a little entertained. Whereas, frankly, I would kind of be bored to talk to Biden. Like, I would be bored. Like, I would probably kind of doze off at some point. And but he also is a genius, and has a good mind, and he's a good leader, and all the things. So, do you think that him being that reality show part of him is going to help him get back into the White House? Like, what part of the conversations you had with him do you think could benefit what he's doing now?
So I think that media is so fractured now, and the Reagan comparison, I think, is very accurate. Reagan was obviously more disciplined, but it was also a different time, right? So there was very few media outlets, and Donald Trump is competing with, in the same way that, movie theaters are competing with Netflix, Donald Trump is competing with so many different ways that people are spending their time and attention. And so he has to be, in a way, over the top to get people to engage, because there's so many other ways in which people are spending their time, and it's so hard to break through. But one of the things that I did in my book, yes, we spent a lot of time together, and I talked to him a lot about The Apprentice. So this is the story of how he came to be through The Apprentice, but it's also a narrative of what it's like to be in his mind space now, and how deflated he was post-presidency. And what was interesting was my first interview with him was in May 2021 in Trump Tower. My last interview with him was in person, was at Mar-a-Lago in November. And I honestly thought, because there was a break in between some of our interviews, and so when I went back, there were all the legal issues that were mounting. He was, people were speculating whether or not he was going to go to jail. It was a very, very challenging time, when you watched what was happening in the media. And so when I went back, I really did think he would be in a worse place, and he was in actually a much better place. He was happy that the poll numbers were high. He was happy he was getting attention. He was happy, even though the civil fraud trial was happening in New York in that day while we were in Florida, he didn't seem that bothered by it. And so that, to me, is all part of this performance art. And I think he's going to run this campaign in the same way that he did in 2016, by banking on the fact that it doesn't matter if it's good press or bad press. If there's press around him, that means there's going to be less press around Biden. And in the end, people will just vote for him because they can't get away from him. I think that is his strategy, and that is the way in which he's running for president.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Certainly pretty disheartening. I mean, don't you think?
Sure, it is. But I also think Donald Trump is he's not I don't think he was created in a vacuum, right? I think he's a symptom of our culture. So if Donald Trump wasn't the first reality TV president, I do think the American people would have probably voted for someone else to be our first reality TV president. And one of the things I do in the book, and this happens toward the end of the book, is that I look at what has happened in our society and why our culture puts so much importance on fame and reality TV. And I love reality TV. And I know that, people always look at it, or sometimes would look at it as something that was lowbrow, or it's going to end the world, or it's awful. And I don't believe any of those things, but I do think that we have to have a language and a dialogue about what's happening here. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because I do think people need to understand the way in which Donald Trump is weaponizing the media to try to get back into the White House.
Well, and also how, I think looking at how Donald Trump was created, I think is a really, I've always been fascinated by Roy Cohn's involvement in Donald Trump's life, because if you go back, Roy Cohn, for people who don't know, was an American lawyer. He was famous for the Ethel and Julius Rosenberg case, like Studio 54, I think, as well, like so many different things in history. But he also was
Barbara Walters briefly, even though
did he date Barbara Walters?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, and he famously, he's
all roads lead back to the View. But yeah, sorry. Continue.
Donald Trump dated Barbara Walters?
No. Roy Cohn. Yeah.
He was gay, right?
Yes, he was gay. And then famously denied his having AIDS right before he passed away, I think. It was like, Roy Cohn's a really fascinating figure, but he was a close confidant of Donald Trump. And if you go back and you watch how Roy Cohn handled a lot of how he publicized the cases he worked on, it's very similar to how Donald Trump communicates about what he does. It's steamrolling, it's distraction, it's the art. And then and Roy Cohn taught him how to do the whole page 6 things, and how Donald Trump was obsessed with page 6 and all of those things. And it's a fascinating case, and sort of like how someone markets themselves through the media. And Donald Trump does that.
And he knows how to do that. And I would argue that Roy allowed Donald Trump to do that on a local level, right? Even though in New York, he still loomed large. He was really primarily a New York celebrity. Yes, he had cameos in Home Alone and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but it wasn't like, and The Nanny in Sex and the City, but it wasn't like, he was into people.
He was a background actor in Sex and the City, Ramin. Thank you.
One scene.
Yes.
Yeah. Where Samantha looks over the bar and sees Donald Trump sitting at the bar. I remember that episode.
But, the boner episode, the Viagra episode. Yeah.
It is a Viagra episode.
Yeah.
But he wasn't coming into people's living rooms every night. And The Apprentice allowed him to take all those techniques and skills and things he'd fine-tuned in New York media and make him a national figure. And it also taught him, because I interviewed Eric Trump for this book as well, and we talked about how influential the show is. And Eric Trump talks about how the show really is the blueprint for their campaigns. The Apprentice, what they learn on The Apprentice is what they also carry with them to the Iowa caucus, to doing interviews, to being in front of the cameras. But it was interesting because Eric talked about how their father being in the boardroom with all these unruly contestants or celebrities and having to improvise and be funny, he uses that in the debates. And I think he'll probably end up using that when he debates Biden. And we certainly saw that the first time around and the second time around. So for him to say, things to Megyn Kelly, or to pivot, or to make nicknames for people, he's very proud of his ability to come up with nicknames. He talks about
He's a bully.
But he's also a reality star. Like, all of those things are things and tropes that are rewarded in reality TV.
Yeah, in other words, he's unhinged and thrives off of it. Being a bully, being not outspoken, being a bully, steamrolling, like just trying to suck up the air, and he's rewarded for it.
He is, because that's what led to ratings when he was a reality star. And so he looks at polling as an extension of his ratings.
Yeah, right. And there's also, the other fascinating thing about your book, and one of the most fascinating figures in the history of television, I think, is Mark Burnett, and how, obviously, creator of Survivor and The Apprentice and other reality shows, famously married to Roma Downing, touched by an angel. She's still touched. But I want to know, like, what, to me, his silence speaks so much, because he famously refuses to communicate and to release tapes that we believe exist within The Apprentice. It's rumored to exist that there are things that Donald Trump has said that Mark Burnett has that he is holding on to with lock and key and not releasing. And so what role do you think Mark Burnett plays in the whole sort of creation of Donald Trump, and could he blow it all up, and is Donald Trump afraid of that?
Mark Burnett enabled Donald Trump. He created Donald Trump. He set the narrative that became The Apprentice. It was his idea to do the show. He hired Donald Trump that first season and continued to renew him. And I think the silence is very interesting and it's very telling because Mark Burnett still does support Donald Trump, but he doesn't want to come out and say anything publicly because he is a Hollywood figure and it is, he is now the black sheep of Hollywood because of his role in creating Donald Trump. So I think he doesn't want to say anything publicly because he wants to have it both ways. He wants people in Hollywood to still like him, but he also wants to be in Trump's inner circle in case Trump becomes president again. So this is like the ultimate reality TV alliance where someone's trying to play all sides. And Mark Burnett, obviously, as a person who brought a Survivor, knows how to play different people off of each other. But if Mark Burnett was to come out and he was to talk about his relationship with Trump and how he enabled him and created him and did this and that and has, there's the boardroom scenes would go on for hours because Trump loved being on camera. And so he would want to improvise for like 4 or 5 hours sometimes in the boardroom. And he was mic'd during a lot of that time. And so some of that footage hasn't come out yet. And so Mark Burnett does have the key to really helping us understand Trump and talking about Trump. And the fact that he refuses to do that is very telling.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, one of the last things I want to ask you about, which I am obsessed with, is Donald Trump's obsession with Deborah Messing. I find it so funny. I find, first off, let me just go.
What is the? Yeah, I don't even know. I don't know anything about.
He has. I mean, it's a blurb in the book, but also
there's a whole chapter on Will and Grace, by the way.
Yes,
Trump's
and
Will and Grace.
There's a great moment at the Emmys. Megan Mullally's talked about this before, and I think I even DM'd with her about this too. But there is there's a moment where Megan Mullally and Donald Trump had to do like a skit, like a Green Acres type skit or whatever, and it's one of the most uncomfortable YouTube Emmys presentation you'll ever watch in your life.
But they're singing. It was a karaoke contest, and they were partners, so they sang the theme song to Green Acres together. And Donald Trump is wearing a farmer's hat and overalls, and she's dressed as Eva Gabor, and they're like singing together on stage.
And
remember that and talked about that because that is what fame means to him, and that is what he was like very excited to relive his singing. And he said he was a genius when it came to music. He had an aptitude for music.
Wow. Well, so there is a whole chapter on Will and Grace, but his obsession with Deborah Messing, can you at least speak to that? Because I find that so wildly weird and funny.
It was wildly weird and funny. And you think he was the leader of the free world. He was the president of the United States. There's so many other people for him to think about, memories for him to hold on to, but he really holds on to this memory in one of the early seasons of The Apprentice. He and Deborah Messing were at an NBC event, and she said that Deborah Messing came up to him in his memory and his recollection and thanked him for helping her show Will and Grace because they were on both on Thursday nights. Because The Apprentice's ratings were so huge, it was helpful to Will and Grace. He said at one point he called it a lead-in, and I said, well, actually, it wasn't a lead-in, Mr. President, or Donald Trump. It wasn't a lead-in because Will and Grace came on before The Apprentice. So I was like, I'm not even sure, how much it really helped the ratings. But then he said, well, it was a lead out. And so he remembers how Deborah Messing had this beautiful red hair. He was talking about her in language that wasn't unlike the language he was using in the Access Hollywood tape about being beautiful. And he did have a little crush on Deborah Messing. And so when she was so vocal about him and always tweeting about how awful he was and saying, the most horrible things about him on social media, he was monitoring that in the White House because he was very hurt that this actress who he found attractive had now turned on him. And one of the biggest things that we talked about in our first meetings together were about all the people in Hollywood that turned on him. He is so fixated on fame, so interested in fame, and it's the ultimate currency for him. That is what is the most important thing for him, winning the acceptance of famous people.
I remember years ago, there was an article too about him trying to break into Hollywood proper and it not going well. But I just remember so clearly this one point in the article where they said they were trying to, maybe it was The Apprentice, but they were trying to film something with him at the beach, and watching him walk onto sand in informal clothes was the oddest, strangest sight you could possibly imagine, just because he doesn't seem like a human who could be that leisurely.
Yeah. And be in Hollywood, basically.
Well, he never lived in Hollywood. He was always a New York figure, but he dreamed of becoming a film producer. And then he went into real estate because it was much safer and it was his dad's business and he was able to inherit everything. But he always he was always interested and fascinated by Hollywood. And so when he got to be on The Apprentice, it was like a dream come true. He finally got to be a star. He finally got to be famous. He finally got to have people love him and repeat his catchphrase, "You're fired." And there were the talking Trump dolls and the board games. And people sometimes forget how popular that show was, but it was a huge phenomenon.
Big,
It was massive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Well,
massive.
Ramin, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you online? Where can they buy your book?
I'm on social media. My handle is just my full name, Ramin Setoodah. And you can buy the book wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, and at your local bookstore.
Amazing. Thank you, Ramin, so much.
Thank you guys.
Thanks.
Always love talking to you.
And another thing.
So there is a thing happening right now. We see the memes all the time of are millennials aging slowly? And you've seen the things of like, can you believe that on Seinfeld, George Costanza was 29 when he started the show? I know, Elliot, calm down. And
I can't.
Or yes, you can. You're able to. And then, or on Cheers, how half the cast was like, Kelsey Grammer was in his 20s when he started as Frasier Crane on Cheers, and all these different things. And people millennials freak the fuck out because we're afraid of getting older.
Yeah.
And so they have this sort of like moral panic dilemma of, what does this mean about me? Am I in a perpetual arrested development, adolescence, whatever you want to call it, or are we aging?
Well, doesn't it look like 40 does? I mean, look, it's probably always going to be that way, that like younger people look younger than they would have 20 years ago. If it's just style and lighting, but it does feel like a topic of conversation. I saw that these pictures on Twitter that were like, these are pictures from a party, a 40th birthday party in like 2003. And I'm sorry, but the people look like they were in their 60s. It was baffling.
And I get that, and they do look old. I don't think they look like they were in their 60s, but I see what you mean.
Yeah,
I know. Yeah, it's probably more like late 40s, 50s. Yes, 50s, they look like 50s. What our parents would dress like, because guess what? They are our parents.
Yeah,
right.
And that's the wild thing. But I also think we see that because we're terrified of getting older, and so we refuse to see something for what it is. If you took George Costanza out of the outfit that he was wearing, and you maybe didn't surround him by cigarette smoke for most of his life, because that's what most of that generation was around or drank all the time, or any of the things that like our culture has since grown away from, like cigarette smoking is down, beauty standards are different, the way we dress is different, all of those things. If you put him in some hipster outfit, he would look like Jack Antonoff, like a lazy Jack Antonoff version in Silver Lake. Like he really would if you put him in that outfit, and you maybe didn't have him surrounded by smoke.
That's actually a good point.
So like, and same with Kelsey Grammer too. Like you can have you've seen the bookish hipsters in Silver Lake or in the East Village or wherever you are that could look like a Kelsey Grammer when he started Cheers. And so the wild thing about this is that I am shocked that people they're so obsessed with this that like they can't just really break down like why we do look younger, quote unquote. And I think a lot of it. So
you think it's more about clothes and like fashion?
Well, I think it's a lot of different things. I think clothes and fashion definitely. I think the realities of health have the way a 29-year-old and their life up until that point in the 1980s and our life right now are two very different things, in that they were likely smoking, they were drinking, they were doing things that, and not that we aren't doing those things, but we aren't doing them in the way that society was everywhere you went back then.
But even so, like I've been rewatching Will and Grace just to see the episodes that I never saw before. I don't know. I just haven't watched it in full ever. Yeah. And Deborah Messing as Grace she talks about how she's in her 30s and like they don't even broach 40. And I watch, and of course she looks young, but I also think part of that POV is like remembering watching it as a young person and thinking 30 looked and sounded incredibly adult.
Well, then the way a 30-year-old dressed for work was very different in 2000 than it is in 2024, and it's even the way, even for me, in journalism, like the way a journalist dressed in 2000 is very different than how I dress. And so like we've gotten more casual, but we also have to consider our generation had the impact of, and I think this is a huge part of it, had the impact of 9/11, the economy crash in 2008. You had COVID, you had Trump, you had all these different things that financially and societally we have been, I think, stunted in terms of our growth and our outlook and our finances in a lot of ways.
So it shows in our
It shows in how we approach our lives and how we dress. We're still dressing like we're in our 20s and 30s, or early 30s. And I think that's a big part of it.
I was chatting with someone, a friend of mine, a female friend of mine recently, and she was saying that she, hasn't worn a skirt to work in something like 20 years. And then I was talking to Elliot recently, and he said he went to work wearing just a raincoat with nothing underneath. And I said, Elliot, you're not allowed to go to work in a raincoat. And he said, it's okay. Sometimes it flaps open. That's all right. I said, good Lord, you're sexual.
Wait, what do you think about the fact that oh, sorry, I just lost my train of thought because now I'm thinking about myself in a raincoat with nothing underneath. Wait, I had it.
Well, also too, I mean, the way we take, I mean, not you guys, because I've heard of how you wash and don't moisturize, but the vast majority of people have been very conscious of sunscreen and of being aware of sort of skincare and all these different things. We're aging in a different, and also too, that generation didn't have Botox like we did. They didn't have the access to a lot of that stuff like we do.
So I was thinking that too, Botox and fillers are so common that it's not even a second thought that everybody seems to just get it. And no judgment. It just feels like that is a big paradigm shift in even 10 years. But I was
medical advancements, I mean, that's what it wasn't available.
The thought that I forgot was there is something to the phenomenon of people we know or our friends or peers. And the idea that if you leave home and you individuate and you move somewhere else, or I don't know, the idea of staying where you grew up, marrying young and having kids early, do you see any sort of traction with that? Because I feel like when I see that happening with people who never left home, who married young, who had a lot of kids right away, they tend to look so much older.
Well, I do think there's something to say. First of all, I mean, obviously, kids will cut into your sleep, and that is a big way, you wake up with bags under the eyes. But I also think, I think there's something to say for if you are single, there is just going to be more pressure, I think, to do and to spend more of your life looking a certain way. I'm not saying everyone does this or everyone feels this, but I just think more often than not, if you take 100 people who are married, you take 100 people who are single, I think probably the single people spend a little bit more time in the gym on average than the married folks. Just because I still want to meet someone and to meet someone in a bar or on the apps, I'm going to try to look as best as I can, as this vessel can.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that pressure is quite as prevalent with married couples. I can hear you guys right now out there. Oh, you.
No, I think you're right. No, I think that's a huge part of it too, because I think, even though it's been going down, as the years have gone on, even now, more and more of our generation, millennials, aren't getting married and having traditional relationships and children in the way that the generation before us, directly above us, did. And so we are just living a different life. But I really do think finances is a big part of it. That the fact that our generation is the first generation that won't likely be able to own a home in our lifetimes, or won't be able to who have this
wouldn't that cause more stress? Wouldn't that cause
I think
more
it causes
stress
more stress, but it also causes more, I think. And I remember I was listening to this, I think on CBS Mornings, this almost like a financial freedom in a way that you're well, I'm always going to be fucked. I'm always going to get the raw end of the deal in terms of all of these things financially, that I'm just going to live my fucking life. I'm going to rent. I'm going to not own a car. I'm going to do those things. I'm going to go to some weird retreat and I'm going to do the things that make me happy, because in the end, savings don't matter. So, and that isn't true. Savings do matter. But but there is this mentality of we're going to always be fucked. And again, because of 9/11, financial crisis, COVID, all these things I think have taught us we are being fucked, you know?
Yeah. I don't know why, but I blame Reagan.
Okay, fair enough.
He just ruined
sure,
everything. He
can.
ruined everything, and I blame him.
Okay, I would support it, sure.
What would your aunt say? Brent, oh, sorry, Brent, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Brent, what would your Aunt Ramona say about something she heard on today's show?
Your Uncle Hamilton is a pud.
My Aunt Joanne would say, well, sure, they were open, but don't you think Hillary's just gay? And I love her. What about Aunt Anne?
Aunt Anne would say, the only thing I'm polyamorous for is cookies. I'll eat anyone. I'll eat anyone. You put it in front of me and I'll eat it.
Sounds delicious. Speaking of cookies, it's time for dinner.
It's time for dinner. I know you can always tell because we're recording
Brent
this late.
antsy.
When Brent is hungry, he's at the end. He's like,
Well,
there's a little bit more silence.
11:30 at night. Like
Hey, you ate it. Isn't it? Did you eat at 6 p.m.?
I had a snack.
A
at like
snack.
Oh,
5:45,
God.
Yeah.
and,
Oh my God, this was like you're being like Mediterranean
I
tonight.
know. And you know what? You know what bothered me? I left out like a frozen turkey patty just to make a quick thing afterwards, and now I'm like, fuck, I might have left it out too long because it
Oh,
thawed.
you're fine. You're
Yeah,
fine.
it's
I think
fine.
you're
Right?
okay.
You're fine. You're
A couple
totally. It's only been a
hours,
couple
but it was
hours.
frozen.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally
Okay.
fine.
Okay. So if I get
Yeah.
sick, Alan is paying my hospital bills. Sound good?
Sure.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I have insurance.